In the summer of 1967, the quiet farming county of Marlow, Ohio, was unsettled by the sudden disappearance of sisters Amy and Beth Whitmore. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a single ribbon, red frayed at the end, caught on the splintered wood of the goat pen's fence. But 6 years later, when a maintenance worker named Paul Bennett stumbled upon a sealed entrance to an underground tunnel beneath the Fairgrounds, he uncovered a truth so harrowing it would unravel the very fabric of the town's history and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. That August afternoon had been heavy with heat. The sky hung low thick with clouds that promised rain but refused to break. The county fair in its 54th year stretched across the old fairgrounds in a scatter of tense livestock pens and the faint mechanical whir of the Ferris wheel turning slow against the horizon. The scent of frying dough and sweet kettle corn clung to the air, mingling with the sharp tang of hay and manure. Amy, just 10, had been darting between stalls with quick light steps. Her small hand clutching the worn strap of a canvas shoulder bag she'd saved for weeks to fill with trinkets. Beth, 2 years older, and already with the steady gait of someone who noticed more than she let on, kept pace beside her. Their parents, busy in the quilting tent where their mother's work was on display, had let them roam. This was Marlow, after all, where danger seemed like something that belonged to bigger towns printed in other people's newspapers. At 3:17 p.m, they were seen near the poultry pavilion, leaning close to examine a cage of white bantams. At 3:42, someone recalled Beth laughing as she tried to win a prize at the ring toss. By 4:05, no one saw them again. When the fair began to close and the loudspeaker crackled with the announcement of lost children, the initial reaction was calm, almost routine. It wasn't until the sheriff arrived, lantern in hand, that the crowd's chatter shifted into something tighter, more anxious. The ribbon was found just after dusk, snagged on the pen's fence post, the wood beneath it darkened with a stain no one could name aloud. By midnight, the fairgrounds were locked down. Lanterns swung in the hands of men combing the fields. Dogs barked into the dark. Somewhere, in the hum between cicadas and distant thunder, the Whitmore sisters were gone. The sheriff's log that night became a patchwork of times, names, and half-remembered details. It was a witness-driven map of where Amy and Beth might have been drawn in ink that blurred as the hours wore on. At 3:17 p.m, Mrs. Elkins, a retired schoolteacher, swore she saw the girls near the carousel. They were standing close to Rex Mallory, a tall, heavy-set man with a red sunburn creeping down his neck. Rex was a seasonal carnival worker known for his easy laughter when sober and his sharp tongue when he wasn't. That afternoon, the faint scent of liquor clung to him and his shirt was damp with sweat. He leaned against the painted rail of the carousel, speaking to the girls. Mrs. Elkins couldn't hear the words, but she noticed Beth's glance toward Amy, quick, uncertain, before they walked away. At 3:29, Tommy Fields, a boy from the next township, claimed he saw them in the games alley. They were watching a bottle ring booth where Jim Keenan stood just outside the roped-off path. Jim was lean, with restless hands and a permanent squint from years of working under the sun. He had a reputation, fights at the tavern, unpaid debts, and the incident 2 summers prior when he'd been barred from the fair for causing trouble. Tommy remembered Jim tossing a piece of popcorn into the air, catching it in his mouth, and grinning as Beth laughed. Then at 3:42, an elderly couple walking near the picnic area noticed the girls sitting at a wooden table across from their Uncle Ted Whitmore. Ted's hands were wrapped around a bottle of cola condensation dripping onto the wood. He had been divorced for less than a year, his wife leaving without warning. Neighbours had whispered about the way Ted lingered near playgrounds lately, always offering candy to children whose parents he knew. That afternoon, they saw him reach into his pocket palm something and slide it across the table toward Amy. By the time these accounts were compared, the contradictions were already apparent. 3 different locations, 3 different men, each with their own shadow of suspicion. The sheriff's deputy underlined the last note in the log 347, "No further sightings." It was as if the sisters had been swallowed whole by the fair itself, their trail dissolving into the shifting noise of the crowd and the layered smells of dust, sugar and oil. The first sweep began just after sunset, when the last Ferris wheel passengers were being unloaded and the midway lights dimmed to a pale ghostly glow. The fairgrounds' cheerful noise had collapsed into the shuffle of boots and the crackle of radio static. Sheriff Adler split the volunteers into sectors: the animal pens, the games alley, the vendor tents, and the narrow strip of cornfields running along the southern fence line. They started with the obvious places, the darkened corners where children might hide if frightened or lost. Beneath bleachers behind prize booths inside the musty storage tents that smelled of old hay and canvas. The air was close thick with the mingled odours of livestock bedding and fried batter that had turned cold. Every so often a call would pierce the night, Amy, Beth. But no answer came back. By 10 p.m, the search had pushed into the cornfields. Lantern lights swung across the stalks, making them seem to lean and twist. Dogs barked at scents only they could read noses pressed low to the ground. At the far end of the property, a volunteer found a child's sandal, but it was traced to a boy who had lost it earlier in the day. The fair's loudspeaker, usually a voice of raffle winners and lost items, gave its last announcement before midnight: all rides and exhibits are now closed. All patrons must leave the grounds. The words sounded hollow in the emptiness. By morning, the search had widened. The sheriff's office brought in deputies from 2 neighbouring counties. Rumours began to drift through town like smoke, each one pointing a finger. Some swore they'd seen Rex slipping behind the beer tent earlier than he admitted. Others claimed Jim had been hanging around the school gym the week before, asking children odd questions. A few quietly mentioned Ted's recent divorce, the bitterness in his voice when family came up. Yet for all the noise, no one could produce a clear, unbroken timeline. Every account ended in a gap, minutes unaccounted for, footsteps lost in the churn of fairground dust. By the 3rd day, the chatter grew quieter. Farmers went back to their field, store owners to their counters. The Whitmore parents remained at the sheriff's office, eyes hollow, as if trying to memorize the faces of those who might have known something, but would never speak it aloud. The fair was over. The ribbons and bunting came down. But the silence left behind felt permanent. It was on the 12th day after the sisters vanished that Deputy Frank Leary found himself in the storage tent at the far edge of the fairgrounds. The main attractions had been dismantled days before, leaving behind only the skeletal frames of rides and the smell of damp earth where concession stands had stood. The tent was unlit, its canvas sides sagging from a recent rainstorm. Dust motes swam in the thin shafts of light cutting through the seams. The air inside was heavy, tinged with the sharp metallic tang of rust or something close to it. Leary had been tasked with inventorying leftover equipment, a tedious job of noting everything from burlap sacks to wooden crates of light bulbs. It was when he pulled a folded length of tarpaulin from a pile that he noticed the stains. Faint at first, but darkening toward the edges, irregular blotches that the deputy's eyes kept returning to. His fingertips brushed over them. The fabric was stiff there, as though whatever had seeped in had dried long ago. Near the stains, caught in a fold of the tarpaulin, was a scrap of cotton, faded blue, with tiny printed flowers. The sheriff's office later confirmed it matched the blouse Amy had been wearing that day. The tent had been assigned to the ride crew, and among them Rex Mallory had worked the late shift. His drinking was no secret bottles hidden in tool crates, the slow stumble in his walk when the sun dipped low. When questioned, Rex admitted he'd been in the tent briefly to retrieve a wrench, but claimed he hadn't noticed anything unusual. His voice carried the defensive edge of a man accustomed to suspicion, his eyes darting between the deputies as though measuring their belief. The tent's proximity to the livestock pens deepened the unease. It was close enough for the red stains to be explained away, an injured animal perhaps, but no one could produce a record of such an incident. Word of the discovery travelled fast. In the cafes and feed stores, conversations dropped to whispers when Rex's name came up. Some insisted it was only a matter of time before he was arrested. Others cautioned that a stain and a scrap of cloth weren't enough to name a killer. Still, the image stuck red against weathered canvas, a piece of a child's blouse lying limp in the dust. It was the first tangible thing they had, and it pointed straight at a man already on the edge of the town's trust. If Rex Mallory had been the easy suspect, Jim Keenan was the obvious one. His name had been circling through conversations since the first night of the search, not because anyone had seen him with the girls for long, but because Jim had a history with the fair that was both public and bitter. In 1965, he'd been thrown out on the second day after a heated argument with a vendor. Witnesses said he'd tipped over a booth and spat on the sheriff's boots before storming away. He hadn't been welcomed back since. That summer of '67 was his first appearance on the grounds in 2 years, and it hadn't gone unnoticed. Jim was 29, wiry from years of labouring in the rail yard. His face bore the creases of a man older than his age, the product of too much sun and too little sleep. He lived alone in a cabin on the edge of the county, a place the tax records claimed but few had visited. On the day of the disappearance, several fairgoers saw him near the games alley. He didn't buy tickets or play, just loitered, leaning on posts flicking bottle caps, with his thumb scanning the crowd. Tommy Fields's recollection of Jim tossing popcorn to Beth became a focal point for the sheriff's office. Why would a man barred from the fair linger there without purpose? When questioned, Jim didn't deny being on the grounds. He said he'd come to see if the place still stank of cheap candy and lies. His voice was even, but the words carried a weight that sounded more like a warning than an insult. Asked about the girls, he shrugged, said they'd been laughing at a booth, and that was all. The deputies noted that Jim's resentment toward the fair ran deep. In one of his prior outbursts, he'd vowed to shut the whole thing down if it was the last thing he did. That threat resurfaced, now reshaped into suspicion. Still, there were no stains, no scraps of clothing, no hard evidence tying him to Amy and Beth. Only his presence, his history, and the sour taste he left in every conversation. In the weeks that followed, his name and Rex's were spoken in the same breath, two men whose shadows seemed to stretch over the fairgrounds even in daylight. Each was watched, each was measured, but the truth, if it was in either of them, remained hidden. Ted Whitmore had not been a name in the early murmurs of suspicion. He was family blood to the girls, and that came with an instinctive layer of trust. But trust in a small town can erode quickly when the ground beneath it starts to shift. At 34, Ted was the younger brother of the girl's father. He had returned to Marlow only months before the fair following a divorce that seemed to hollow him out from the inside. His wife had left abruptly, taking their 2 children to her parents' home in Dayton. The reasons were never stated outright, but whispers clung to the story of arguments in public, of an incident at the local pool where Ted had been seen speaking too closely to children not his own. At the fair, Ted had been spotted in the picnic area with Amy and Beth, not long before they disappeared. Witnesses remembered him leaning across the table, sliding something toward Amy. The sheriff's deputies later learned it was a small carved wooden horse, a trinket he'd whittled himself. Ted explained that it was a gift, nothing more, but the gesture acquired a different tone when viewed through the lens of suspicion. His behaviour after the disappearance only deepened the unease. While others scoured fields and sheds, Ted seemed detached, drifting along the search lines without urgency. When questioned, he gave vague, looping answers about where he had been, often contradicting himself within minutes. He mentioned leaving the picnic area to get some pie, but no vendor recalled serving him. Sheriff Adler knew the danger of confirmation bias. Once a person fell under suspicion, every gesture could be interpreted as guilt. Yet Ted made it easy for others to see shadows where there might have been none. He lingered outside the sheriff's office late into the night, claiming he wanted updates. He volunteered to help search the animal barns, though no one had asked. By the third week, Ted's name had joined Rex's and Jim's in the private conversations of the deputies. The three men formed an uneasy triangle in the investigation, each plausible in motive and opportunity. Still, there was something about Ted that didn't quite align with the others. His connection to the girls was intimate, personal. If he were involved, the act would not have been random. It would have been born of something far more complicated and far more dangerous. By 1973, the disappearance of Amy and Beth Whitmore had faded into that uneasy category of memory the town did not speak of, but could never quite let go. The fair continued each summer, its bright banners masking the unspoken weight beneath the laughter and music. But for some, the absence lingered like a hollow in the air. Paul Bennett was not from Marlow. He'd taken the janitor's job at the Fairgrounds after moving from Cincinnati, a quiet man with a habit of humming to himself when he worked. In early October, while clearing debris near the southern fence line, his broom handle struck something hollow beneath a layer of packed earth and weeds. The ground there was uneven, sunken in places from years of runoff. Paul crouched, pressing his ear to the soil, then fetched a spade from the maintenance shed. The first shovelful revealed wood splintered, warped. He cleared more until he found a small hatch, its rusted hinges holding fast until he forced them apart with a crowbar. The air that rose from the opening was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of damp stone and mildew. His flashlight beam caught narrow walls braced with rotting beams, and beyond that, a tunnel sloping gently downward. It was not on any map of the Fairgrounds. Inside the passage, twisted and branched the floor gritty under his boots. Just past the first bend, he found them a small pile of clothing, faded and moth-eaten, child-sized. One blouse still bore faint blue flowers. Nearby lay a camera, its metal body corroded but intact, the film within degraded yet still salvageable. Against the far wall sat a metal box. Inside were scraps of paper, each covered in strange, precise symbols, a code no one present could decipher at first glance. Paul emerged from the tunnel, pale and silent, walking straight to the sheriff's office. By nightfall, deputies and state investigators had cordoned off the area. The town watched from the fence line as evidence bags filled blouses, shoes, film canisters, coded notes. It was the first time in 6 years that the investigation felt alive again. And yet, as the flashbulbs popped and the inventory grew, no one could yet see the shape of the truth these items formed. The tunnel had been there all along, beneath the fair, beneath their feet, hiding the story they had all been trying to find. The items from the tunnel were catalogued in the evidence room under tight security. Each object was numbered, photographed, and sealed. Most were silent in their meaning, blouses too worn to yield fingerprints. The camera's degraded film offering only blurred shapes and warped shadows when developed. But one item refused to fade into ambiguity. It was found wedged in a crack between 2 stones near the tunnel's far wall, a small round medal, tarnished but still legible. On its face was the embossed image of a lamb under a star. On the reverse, an inscription in block letters, St. Matthew's Youth Fellowship, Marlow, Ohio. St. Matthew's was the town's only church of that denomination, a squat brick building on the hill above Main Street. The youth group had been active for decades, its programs drawing children from across the county for Sunday lessons, choir practice, and summer events, including volunteer work at the fair. The medal was brought to Reverend Cole, who recalled they had been given out in the early 1960s to children who completed a year of attendance. "We ordered them from a catalogue," he said, running his thumb over the worn surface. They were meant as keepsakes, nothing more. He couldn't recall who in the congregation might have lost one at the fairgrounds, but he remembered one person who kept a box of the extras, Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, the church's longtime volunteer coordinator. Mrs. Henderson was a fixture in Marlow. Widowed young, she'd raised a son alone until his death in a riding accident more than a decade earlier. Since then, she'd poured herself into the church and the community, her gentle voice a familiar comfort at potlucks and charity drives. She'd overseen the youth group for years, organising craft tables at the fair and staffing the information booth near the main gate. When questioned, she smiled softly and said she'd probably dropped it herself. During one of the fairs, she was always carrying small prizes for the children. Her explanation was reasonable, almost inevitable, and yet something about it lingered in the minds of the deputies. A medal might be nothing, but in the cold air of that tunnel, buried beneath the earth, its presence seemed like the first line of a story no one yet knew how to read. The tunnel's discovery reignited public pressure, but it also splintered the investigation. The evidence, fragmented and suggestive, seemed to lean toward all three long-standing suspects at once, drawing the sheriff's office into a tangle of competing theories. The camera photographs, though warped, contained shapes that could be read as the shadow of a broad-shouldered man. To some deputies, it was Rex Mallory, his size and posture, unmistakable even in silhouette. The red stains on the canvas, the blouse scrap, and his known drinking were folded into the case against him. Then there were the coded notes. Handwriting experts suggested they might be tied to Jim Keenan, who was known to spend long evenings alone at the rail yard sketching symbols on scraps of cardboard. The bitterness he'd harboured toward the fair fitted neatly into a revenge narrative. It wasn't hard to picture him using the tunnels to sabotage the event, or worse. Ted Whitmore's connection was more personal. The child-sized clothing in the tunnel could have been hidden there by someone with access to the girl's belongings. His inconsistent timeline and the carved wooden horse were cited again this time as tokens from a man whose attachment to the sisters might have been unhealthy. Investigators split their time between the three men, re-interviewing witnesses, searching their properties, and tracking down every shred of rumour from 6 years earlier. Each suspect gave something away, a shift in the eyes, a bristling at certain questions, but none gave enough. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson continued to volunteer, helping catalogue the recovered items for public display at the town hall. Her name appeared in the case notes only as a tangential contact for the medal, her role dismissed as incidental. She moved easily through the rooms, offering tea to tired deputies, nodding gently as they discussed their theories about Rex, Jim and Ted. The more they chased these men, the more the investigation stalled. Each lead seemed to collapse under its own weight, leaving only more questions. And in that vacuum, the wrong trails grew deeper, their false promise keeping eyes turned away from a truth that was quietly standing in the room with them. By the winter of 1973, the investigation had reached a standstill. The evidence from the tunnel sat boxed in the sheriff's archive. The suspects watched, but not charged. The town's patience thinned, yet the fair board pressed forward with plans for the next summer, determined to prove the grounds were safe. At community meetings, Mrs. Eleanor Henderson often sat in the second row, her hands folded neatly over her purse. She had a calm presence, the kind that seemed to slow the tempo of a tense room. People spoke to her easily, even deputies who had been chasing dead-end leads for months. When the town hall agreed to display select items from the tunnel in a glass case, partly to invite new tips, partly to appease a restless public, Mrs. Henderson volunteered to help arrange them. She handled the objects with care, smoothing the folds of the blouses, aligning the worn shoes so they faced forward. "They were loved," she murmured once, almost too quietly to hear. Her grief for her own lost son was a known part of her history, spoken of with the same gentle reverence reserved for family tragedies. In 1961, he had been thrown from a horse during a 4-H event, his neck broken before the ambulance arrived. After that, she had given herself over to the youth programs, planning games and crafts and ensuring no child felt left out. The deputies noticed she seemed to remember every detail of the fair layouts from years past, where booths had been, which paths were shaded at certain hours, even the location of utility hatches no one had mentioned in the interviews. When asked, she attributed it to years of helping behind the scenes. No one doubted her sincerity. She was there when the Whitmore parents visited the display, standing a respectful distance away. Her expression softened with something like shared pain. She pressed a small handkerchief into Mrs. Whitmore's hand before they left. To the townspeople, Mrs. Henderson was the image of community care. To the investigation, she remained outside the circle of suspicion, present, helpful, unassuming. And so, when the sheriff's attention turned once again toward Rex, Jim and Ted, her presence at the edges of every meeting and evidence review drew no comment. She was the kind face in the crowd, the one everyone assumed they understood. The break came not through new evidence, but through an old oversight. In early spring of 1974, Deputy Leary, sorting through unsorted property logs, found a folder marked simply Maintenance Requests 1965-1968. Inside were work orders for electrical repairs, plumbing adjustments and structural checks around the fairgrounds. One request caught his eye, summer 1966. Inspect drainage tunnel access points. One hatch loose near livestock pens. The request had been signed off by the volunteer coordinator at the time, E. Henderson. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it meant Mrs. Henderson had known about the tunnels at least a year before the girls vanished. That detail, paired with her uncanny memory of fair layouts, began to feel less like community pride and more like familiarity with a hidden world under the fair. Leary pulled the coded notes from storage. A linguistics professor from Columbus found that the symbols weren't random, they spelled out Bible verses when translated through a simple substitution cipher. The selected verses were all about guidance, obedience, and the Lord's children. One in particular, Matthew 18:3, was underlined. "Except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." The phrasing, especially the underlining, reminded Reverend Cole of how Mrs. Henderson marked her Sunday school lesson plans. She had a distinctive way of boxing key phrases in neat rectangles, a habit no one else in the congregation seemed to share. When shown the photographs from the tunnel's camera again, one investigator noticed something overlooked before in the blurred background of two frames was a corner of patterned fabric faded roses on cream. It matched the apron Mrs. Henderson was often seen wearing at the fair's craft booth. Interviews with older youth group members revealed another small detail. Mrs. Henderson often carried candy and small trinkets in her pockets during the fair, coaxing shy children to follow her behind the booth to see something special. Individually, each clue could be explained away. Together they formed a shape that no longer fit the image of a harmless volunteer. The tunnels, the versus the trinkets, the apron they aligned too neatly. For the first time, the investigation turned fully toward the one person who had never been on their suspect list. The kind face in the crowd had been standing in the shadows of their own certainty all along. Confronting Mrs. Henderson was unlike any other interview in the case. She welcomed the deputies into her parlour, the air heavy with the scent of lavender polish and old books. Lace curtains filtered the afternoon light into pale ribbons across the carpet. On the mantel sat a single-framed photograph of a boy astride a chestnut horse, his smile frozen in a summer that would never return. When asked about the tunnels, she didn't flinch. Yes, she knew of them. She had found them herself years before while helping move storage crates after a storm. No, she had never told the fair board children liked secret places, she said, and she thought it might be a haven for those who needed quiet. The coded notes, she admitted, were hers. She spoke of them as lessons she had prepared for Amy and Beth, ways to help them understand the virtues of obedience and purity. Her voice softened when she described their sweet faces in the dim light of the tunnel, how they reminded her so much of her son. The truth came slowly, but without denial. She had lured them from the midway with the promise of helping prepare a surprise in the craft booth. They had followed willingly. Why wouldn't they? She was Mrs. Henderson. Once inside the tunnel, she said she kept them safe from the noise and the crowds. She brought them food, sang to them, told them they would be her children now. But the days blurred. Food ran low. One became ill. She hadn't meant for them to die. She pressed her hands to her cheeks when she said it, as if to keep the words from escaping. The deputies listened in silence, the shape of the case settling around them. The red stains on the tent, the grudge of Jim, the shadow of Ted. They had all been the wrong trails. The real danger had been a grief so deep it warped into possession, hidden behind kindness and service, until it was too late to see. As they led her away, Mrs. Henderson's gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel. For a moment she seemed smaller, as if the years had folded in on her. As they stepped out into the cold air, Deputy Leary looked at the shuttered fairgrounds one last time. The real journey was just beginning. Evil had worn a familiar face, but the quiet truth was, this love twisted into control can be just as lethal as hate. He glanced at Paul Bennett beside him. She fooled everyone. Not forever, Paul said. They walked toward a future the town would have to rebuild one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.